The poor young girl let a strange man and his son stay for one night, unaware he was the vampire king who had returned to claim not just her mercy, but her heart. "Step back from the door," Marin shouted, her voice cracking as she gripped the iron fire poker with trembling hands. "Please," came a man's voice from the other side, deep and strangely formal, nearly swallowed by the howling wind. "I mean no harm. My son needs shelter. Just for tonight." Marin's pulse hammered in her throat. Through the frost-glazed window, she could make out the silhouette of a tall figure hunched protectively over something much smaller. A child. Snow whipped around them in violent spirals, thick enough to blur their edges. Her knuckles whitened on the poker. "I don't open my door to strangers," she said sharply. "Especially not in the middle of nowhere. Especially not men." There was a pause. When the voice came again, it was lower, quieter, laced with something that sounded like restrained anguish. "Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. I understand your fear. I would not ask if there were any other choice. He is burning with fever. He will not survive the night in this storm." Marin hesitated. The cold had already seeped through the gaps in the cabin's old wooden frame. The power had gone out 2 hours ago. Only the fireplace kept the single room from becoming a frozen tomb. She glanced at her phone on the table. No signal. No one to call. Just her, the storm, and whatever was on the other side of that door. She moved to the peephole again, her breath fogging the glass. The man shifted slightly, and she saw him clearly for the first time. Snow-white hair plastered to his sharp-boned face, an old-world coat heavy with frost, and in his arms, a small boy curled tightly against his chest. The child's face was pale as death, lips faintly blue. A thin, crooked crown rested on his head, too ornate, too strange to be a toy. Then the boy coughed, a wet, rattling sound that tore through the wind like a blade. That was enough. With a low groan from the ancient hinges, Marin yanked the door open. Snow exploded inward, stinging her face and freezing her breath. The man stepped forward just enough for her to see him fully now, tall, unnaturally still, eyes the color of dark wine reflecting the firelight behind her. "Get inside. Quickly," she muttered, stepping aside. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying an odd weight, as though the words cost him something. He moved with eerie grace, cradling the boy as he stepped over the threshold. Marin slammed the door shut and bolted it. "Sit by the fire. Don't touch anything else." The stranger obeyed without question, lowering himself carefully onto the threadbare rug near the hearth. He unwrapped his heavy coat and draped it around the boy instead, his movements painfully gentle. Marin stood frozen, still gripping the poker, watching. "Your name?" she demanded. "Lucien," he replied, brushing frost from the child's hair with long, pale fingers. "And this is Aaron. He is unwell." "Unwell?" Marin scoffed bitterly. "You're dragging a sick child through a blizzard in the middle of the night. That's not unwell. That's insane." Lucien's jaw tightened, but he didn't look up. "We had nowhere else to go." She studied him in the firelight. His clothes were archaic, embroidered, heavy, like something pulled from a museum. His skin was too pale, almost luminous against the shadows. And his eyes, they didn't reflect light the way they should. "Why are you out here?" she pressed. "There's nothing for miles. The storm's been on every news channel for days." Lucien's gaze finally lifted to meet hers, and for a moment, Marin forgot how to breathe. His eyes weren't just red, they glowed, faintly, like embers buried in ash. "We were traveling," he said carefully. "The roads closed behind us. We became trapped." She didn't believe him. Not entirely. There was something he wasn't saying, something ancient and dangerous lurking behind that measured tone. But the boy, Aaron, coughed again, weaker this time, and his small hand clutched at Lucien's sleeve as though holding on for life. Marin exhaled sharply and turned toward the kitchen. I have soup. And blankets. That's all I can offer. That is more than enough, Lucien said quietly. Minutes later, she returned with 2 cracked bowls of broth and a pile of worn quilts. Lucien accepted them with a reverence that made her uncomfortable, as though she'd offered him something sacred instead of leftovers. She handed Arin's bowl directly to Lucien, then retreated to the far corner of the room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The silence that followed was thick, but not hostile. Just the crackle of burning wood, the occasional clink of the spoon against ceramic, and the relentless howl of wind outside. Arin managed only a few sips before his head drooped against Lucien's shoulder, eyes fluttering closed. Lucien set the bowl aside and cradled the boy against his chest, one hand resting protectively over the small crown. Marin stared into the flames, forcing herself to stay alert. She hated this, the intrusion, the fear, the way her mind kept dragging her back to the last time she'd opened her door to a stranger. That time, she'd lost everything. You do not need to be afraid, Lucien said softly. I'm not afraid, she lied, though her voice wavered. Then you are braver than most, he replied. Letting 2 strangers into your home in the dead of night. That takes courage. Or stupidity, she muttered. A faint smile ghosted across his lips. So brief, she almost missed it. Perhaps both. For the first time since the door opened, the room felt a fraction less cold. One night, Marin said firmly, meeting his strange, glowing gaze. By morning, the storm will pass. Then you leave. Lucien inclined his head, a gesture that looked oddly formal, almost regal. One night. That is all we require. She looked at the boy sleeping in his arms, then back at the man who held him with such devastating tenderness. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if opening the door had been the worst mistake of her life, or the first choice that would ever truly matter. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin's shutters and clawing at the walls. The fire in the hearth flickered stubbornly, casting restless shadows that danced across the rough-hewn beams. The power was completely gone now, swallowed by the storm. Marin lit 2 half-melted candles she kept for emergencies, their flames trembling as she placed them on the small wooden table between herself and the stranger. The soup had cooled, but warmth still lingered in the air, fragile, tentative. Arin had managed only a few spoonfuls before sleep claimed him again. Now he lay wrapped in quilts on the sagging couch, his breathing shallow but steadier than before. The strange little crown had slipped slightly, resting crooked against his temple. Marin sat on the floor near the fire, knees pulled to her chest, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. Lucien sat across from her, still as stone, his own mug untouched. His face was half illuminated by the firelight, half lost to shadow. And though neither of them spoke, Marin could feel it, the weight of unspoken things settling between them like snow. Something had begun the moment she opened that door. Something that could not be undone. This is where you would naturally flow into Marin's backstory, her isolation, her past betrayal, why she lives alone in this cabin, and why opening the door to strangers terrifies her. The intimate fireside setting and Lucien's quiet presence create the perfect emotional space for reflection and deeper character revelation. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Lucien reached for one of the towels Marin had brought, unfolding it with movements that were too deliberate, too precise, as though he'd learned the gesture centuries ago and never forgotten. He began drying Arin's hair with a father's quiet devotion, each stroke careful, reverent. You have my gratitude, he said, his voice carrying that same strange formality. Your kindness tonight, it will not be forgotten. Marin shifted uncomfortably. It's just soup and blankets. To us, it is far more. She frowned, studying him across the firelight. The way he spoke, your gratitude, will not be forgotten. It wasn't just polite. It was old. Archaic, like he'd stepped out of a different time entirely. How long have you been traveling? She asked. Longer than I care to remember. That's not an answer. Lucien's lips curved faintly. No, it is not. He shifted closer to the fire, but Marin noticed something odd. Despite sitting mere inches from the flames, his skin never flushed with warmth. No color bloomed in his cheeks. No sweat formed on his brow. He looked as cold and pale as the moment he'd stepped through her door. She pulled her own blanket tighter, suddenly aware of how much heat the fire wasn't giving him. Aren't you cold? She asked. I am accustomed to it. Before she could press further, Lucien rose smoothly and moved toward the small table where the candles flickered. But as he approached, he stopped just short of the light's reach, standing in the shadow between the fire and the glow. His eyes caught the candlelight for just a moment, red, unmistakably red, before he turned away. Marin's breath hitched. She told herself it was a trick of the flames, a reflection, nothing more, but her instincts screamed otherwise. You're running from something, she said quietly. Aren't you? Lucien stilled. For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost resigned. We are all running from something, are we not? Marin's chest tightened. She looked down at her hands, at the thin scars along her knuckles from the years she'd spent trying to rebuild this place alone. I came here to get away from people, from trust. Someone hurt you. It wasn't a question. She laughed bitterly. Someone I let in. Someone I thought I knew. He took everything, my savings, my dignity, my ability to sleep through the night without wondering if I'd been a fool. She met Lucien's gaze, defiant. So yeah, I don't do strangers anymore. I don't trust. Lucien regarded her with something that looked almost like sorrow. Then I am honored you made an exception tonight. Don't be. I did it for the kid, not you. Even so. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind howled like a chorus of the damned. What about you? Marin asked, her voice quieter now. Why are you really out here with him? Lucien's expression darkened. He looked down at Arin, who slept fitfully on the couch, small fists clenched in the blankets. My son is all I have left, he said, and the rawness in his voice made Marin's throat tighten. Everything I have done, everything I will do, is to keep him safe. There was something devastating in the way he said it. Not just love, but desperation. Grief. Marin found herself standing without thinking, crossing the room toward the couch. Arin's forehead was still warm, too warm. She hesitated, then reached out and pressed the back of her hand gently against his skin. The boy's breathing immediately steadied. His small body relaxed, the tension melting from his limbs as though her touch had soothed something deep within him. Marin pulled her hand back, startled. That was remarkable, Lucien finished, his voice barely above a whisper. He was staring at her with something close to reverence, as though she'd just performed a miracle. He has not rested this peacefully in weeks. I didn't do anything. You did more than you know. Before she could respond, a sound cut through the night. A low, rhythmic thud-thud-thud from somewhere beyond the cabin walls. Too steady to be windy. Too heavy to be branches. Marin froze. What was that? Lucien was on his feet instantly, his entire posture rigid, predatory. His eyes flicked toward the door, then the windows, scanning the darkness beyond with an intensity that made her stomach drop. Lucien? It is nothing, he said, but his voice was tight, controlled. A lie. The sound came again, closer this time. Deliberate. Circling. That doesn't sound like nothing, Marin hissed. What's out there? Nothing that will reach you while I stand here. The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it terrified her. She grabbed another blanket from the chest in the corner, her hands shaking now. When she returned, she found Lucien still standing guard near the window, his silhouette tense against the faint glow of the fire. But his gaze had softened when it fell on Arin, and she saw it, the aching, bone-deep worry of a father who had already lost too much. Here, she said quietly, offering him the blanket. You'll freeze. He took it, though they both knew he didn't need it. Thank you. She wanted to ask more, demand answers. But exhaustion was dragging at her bones, and her chair by the fire suddenly looked impossibly inviting. Marin sank into it, pulling her knees up, her eyes growing heavy despite the fear still thrumming in her veins. The warmth of the fire wrapped around her like a lullaby she couldn't resist. Just before sleep claimed her, she heard it, a low, melodic whisper in a language she didn't recognize. Lucien was kneeling beside Arin now, one pale hand resting on the boy's chest, his lips moving in words that sounded older than the mountains themselves. Marin tried to stay awake. I tried to listen, but the darkness pulled her under. When the fire burned low, casting the cabin into near shadow, Lucien finally stopped whispering. He rose silently, his gaze drifting to the window where the forest pressed close, dark and watchful. His jaw clenched. They had found him, and they were waiting. Marin woke to silence. Not the comfortable quiet of morning, but the kind of silence that felt wrong. Too complete, too heavy, like the world had been muffled beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Her neck ached from sleeping curled in the chair. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, barely enough to cast light. Cold had crept back into the cabin, seeping through the walls and settling in her bones. She blinked groggily, her gaze drifting to the couch where Arin had been sleeping. Empty. Marin's heart lurched. She sat up quickly, scanning the dim room. Lucien. No answer. She pushed herself out of the chair, her legs stiff and unsteady. Arin. Nothing. Just the faint whisper of wind against the windows and the soft hiss of dying embers. They were gone. Marin moved through the cabin like a ghost, checking every corner, every shadow. The small bathroom, empty. The narrow closet, empty. She even checked behind the woodpile, as if a grown man and a child could somehow hide in the gaps between logs. Nothing. Her breath came faster now, fog blooming in the cold air. She turned back to the main room, and that's when she noticed it, the eerie neatness of everything. The blankets she'd given them were folded with military precision and stacked on the arm of the couch. The soup bowls had been washed and placed carefully beside the sink, still faintly damp. Even the towels Lucien had used to dry Arin were hung neatly over the back of a chair. It was too intentional, too careful. Marin crossed to the door and reached for the bolt. It was locked. From the inside, her hand froze on the cold metal. She stared at the bolt, her mind racing. They couldn't have left through the door, not without unbolting it. And the windows were too small, the frames warped and frozen shut. So how? She yanked the door open, and snow tumbled inward, a small avalanche that had built up against the threshold during the night. Beyond, the world was blindingly white. The storm finally passed. Morning light filtered through heavy clouds, casting everything in shades of gray and silver. Marin stepped out onto the porch, her socks immediately soaking through. She looked down. No footprints. The snow was smooth, undisturbed, as though no one had walked through it in hours. As though Lucien and Arin had simply vanished into thin air. No, she whispered. That's not possible. She moved around the side of the cabin, searching desperately for any sign of them. Footprints, drag marks, anything. But the snow was pristine, unmarred except for the faint impressions of her own feet. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Marin stumbled back inside, shivering violently now, her mind spinning. Maybe she'd dreamed of it. Maybe the isolation had finally gotten to her, and she'd hallucinated the whole thing. The knocking, the stranger, the boy with the crown. But then her gaze fell on the table, and she saw it. A ring. Black iron, heavy and old, resting in the exact center of the wooden surface, like an offering. She approached it slowly, as though it might disappear if she moved too quickly. The ring was engraved with a crest she didn't recognize, an intricate design of thorns and wings wrapped around a crown. The metalwork was exquisite, ancient, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. Marin reached out and picked it up. It was cold. Not just cool to the touch, but unnaturally frigid, like metal that had been buried in snow for years. The cold bit into her palm, sharp and almost painful, but she couldn't bring herself to drop it. She turned it over in her fingers, studying the engraving. The design was hauntingly beautiful, almost alive in the way the lines seemed to shift in the light. Why would he leave this? She thought about the way Lucien had moved, too graceful, too still. The way he'd never warmed by the fire. The way his eyes had glowed red in the candlelight. The way Aaron had stopped struggling the moment she touched him. Just travelers, she whispered to herself, trying to make the words feel true. They were just travelers, lost in the storm, nothing more. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Nothing about them had been ordinary. Nothing about last night made sense. And yet they'd been real. She could still smell the faint scent of wood smoke and something older, something like leather and iron. She could still see the way Lucien had held Aaron, the desperate tenderness in every movement. Maren closed her fist around the ring, feeling its weight settle in her palm. She should throw it away. Forget this ever happened. Go back to her quiet, isolated life and pretend the storm hadn't brought two strangers to her door. But instead, she slipped the ring into her pocket. She didn't know why. The morning stretched on in uneasy silence. Maren tried to busy herself, rebuilding the fire, checking her supplies, convincing herself that everything was fine. But the cabin felt different now. Haunted almost. Like the walls themselves remembered what had happened here. By midday, she couldn't stand it anymore. She pulled on her boots and coat and stepped outside, needing air, needing space, needing to prove to herself that she wasn't losing her mind. The snow crunched beneath her feet as she walked to the edge of the clearing, her breath fogging in the cold. The forest stretched out before her, dark and infinite, the trees skeletal against the gray sky. And that's when she saw them. Shapes. Faint silhouettes standing among the distant trees, barely visible through the snow-laden branches. Too still to be animals. Too deliberate to be shadows. Watching her, Maren's blood turned to ice. She took a step back, her hand instinctively moving to her pocket, fingers closing around the cold iron ring. The figures didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched. And deep in her pocket, the ring began to warm. 3 days passed, then 4. The storm that was supposed to ease never did. Instead, it returned with renewed fury, battering the cabin with wind and snow that piled higher against the walls each morning. The world beyond Maren's windows became a white void, endless and suffocating. And with each passing day, her supplies dwindled. Half a can of soup left, a handful of crackers, 2 tea bags, firewood that wouldn't last another week. Maren rationed what she had, eating just enough to keep the gnawing ache in her stomach at bay. But hunger wasn't her only problem. The shadows in the forest had grown bolder. It started the second night after Lucien vanished. Maren woke to a sound, something moving outside the cabin, crunching through snow with footsteps too heavy to be human, too deliberate to be animal. In the morning, she found the tracks. Enormous prints circled the cabin in a wide, predatory loop. They were vaguely canine but far too large, each one pressed deep into the snow with long, dragging claw marks trailing behind. Maren stood on the porch, staring at them, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Wolves didn't leave tracks like that. Nothing natural did. She thought about the figures she'd seen in the trees, the way they'd stood so still, watching, waiting. By the 4th night, the scratching began. Maren was sitting by the fire, trying to conserve what little warmth remained in the dying embers, when she heard it, a slow, deliberate scrape against the cabin door. Not the random scratch of a branch. Not the scrape of wind-blown debris. This was purposeful, rhythmic. Scrape, scrape, scrape. And then, barely audible beneath the howling wind, a voice whispered through the wood. Maren. She shot to her feet, heart hammering. The fire poker was in her hands before she even realized she'd grabbed it. Maren opened the door. The voice was soft, lilting, almost sweet, but wrong. Too hollow. Too cold. "Get away from my house," she shouted, her voice cracking. The scratching stopped. Silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. Marin stood frozen, barely breathing, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. But nothing came. Not that night. By the 5th day, Marin knew she couldn't stay any longer. Her food was nearly gone. The firewood was running out. If she didn't get to town soon, she wouldn't survive another week. She bundled herself in every layer she owned and set out at dawn, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the mountain pass. The cold bit at her exposed skin, turning her fingers numb despite her gloves. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It took her 2 hours to reach the pass, or what was left of it. The entire mountainside had collapsed. A massive avalanche had torn through the narrow road, burying it beneath tons of rock and ice. The path to town was completely obliterated. Marin stood at the edge of the destruction, staring at the impassable wall of debris. Her chest tightened. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She was trapped. Completely, utterly trapped. Her hand moved instinctively to her pocket, fingers closing around the black iron ring. The moment she touched it, warmth spread through her palm, not the searing heat of the fire, but a steady, reassuring pulse, like a heartbeat. It shouldn't have been possible. Metal didn't generate warmth, but the ring did. And somehow, impossibly, it calmed her. Marin forced herself to breathe. She turned back toward the cabin, moving as quickly as the snow would allow. She needed to get inside. Needed to think. Needed to. "Marin." She froze. The voice came from somewhere in the trees, soft, fragile, heartbreakingly familiar. A child's voice. "Marin, please." "Arin," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me." Her heart lurched. She took a step toward the voice, then another, snow crunching beneath her boots. "Arin, where are you?" "I'm cold, so cold." Logic screamed at her to stop, to turn around, to run. But the desperation in that small voice pulled at something deep inside her, the same instinct that had made her open the door that first night. She pushed deeper into the trees, scanning the shadows. "Arin, keep talking. I'll find you." Movement flickered at the edge of her vision, something dark and fast, darting between the trees. Marin spun around. Nothing. But the air had changed. It felt heavier now, charged with predatory intent. "Marin." The voice called again, but this time it was wrong, stretched, distorted, no longer quite human. Her blood turned to ice. She ran. Snow exploded around her as she crashed through the forest, branches tearing at her coat, her lungs burning with cold air. Behind her, she heard it, the sound of something massive giving chase, moving with impossible speed, its breathing a wet, rasping snarl. The cabin appeared through the trees like a beacon. Marin sprinted the final distance, her boots skidding on ice as she hit the porch. She fumbled with the door, threw herself inside, and slammed it shut behind her. The bolt slid home with a metallic click. For a moment, there was only silence and the sound of her ragged breathing. Then something slammed against the door with enough force to rattle the entire frame. Marin screamed, stumbling backward. She grabbed the heaviest chair and shoved it against the door, then the table, then anything else she could move. Another impact. The wood groaned, but held. Outside, something circled the cabin. She could hear its footsteps, heavy and deliberate, testing the walls, the windows, searching for a way in. Marin pressed her back against the far wall, the fire poker clutched in her shaking hands. The ring in her pocket pulsed with warmth, as though trying to tell her something. The circling stopped. Silence fell. Marin didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, in the suffocating quiet, she whispered the only words that came to her. Words she didn't even realize she needed to say. "Lucien, where are you?" The ring flared hot against her leg. And somewhere, In a place between shadow and eternity, a king opened his eyes. Marin woke to the smell of smoke and frost. Her body ached from sleeping upright against the wall. The fire poker still gripped loosely in her hand. Morning light filtered through the cabin windows, pale and gray. The barricade she'd built against the door still stood, undisturbed. Whatever had hunted her last night was gone. For now. She pushed herself to her feet, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. The cabin was quiet again, too quiet. She began to move the furniture away from the door, checking the bolt, checking the windows, checking everything. Nothing was broken. Nothing was open. But as she turned back toward the main room, her breath caught. On the table, the same table where Lucien had left the ring, sat a black envelope. Marin froze, her heart stuttering in her chest. She hadn't heard anyone enter, hadn't heard anything at all. The door was still bolted. The windows were still latched. And yet there it was, resting in the exact center of the table, as though placed there by invisible hands. She approached it slowly, every instinct screaming at her to leave it alone. But she couldn't, not anymore. The envelope was made of paper so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. No address, no postage, just a wax seal pressed into the fold, silver and gleaming, stamped with the same intricate crest that adorned the ring. Thorns, wings, a crown. Marin's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The wax was cold, unnaturally so, and it crumbled beneath her fingers like frost. She pulled out a single sheet of parchment, the script elegant and flowing, written in ink that shimmered faintly red in the morning light. Marin Hale, you are summoned to attend the gathering under the blood moon. What was given cannot be returned. What was awakened cannot be undone. The ring will guide you. Come willingly, or be claimed by those who hunt you. No signature. No explanation. Just a command. Marin's hands shook so badly, she nearly dropped the letter. She read it again, then a third time, as though the words might change. But they didn't. The ring will guide you. She pulled the black iron ring from her pocket, turning it over in her palm. In the daylight, the engraving seemed even more detailed. Every thorn, every feather of the wings carved with impossible precision. Almost without thinking, she slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The moment the metal touched her skin, warmth flooded through her. Not just heat, but something alive, something pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. The ring seemed to tighten slightly, not painfully, but as though it was settling into place. Claiming her, Marin tried to pull it off. It wouldn't budge. Panic flared in her chest. She tugged harder, twisting the metal, but it stayed firm, as though it had fused with her very bone. No, no, no. Movement caught her eye. She looked up and saw her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. But it wasn't just a reflection. For a brief, impossible moment, she saw him, Aaron, standing just behind her shoulder, his small face no longer pale and fevered, but healthy, glowing. His eyes were bright, and he reached out toward her with one small hand, his lips forming a single, silent word. Stay. Marin spun around. Nothing. The cabin was empty. She looked back at the mirror. Just her own terrified face stared back. I'm losing my mind, she whispered. But the ring pulsed again, warm and insistent, as if to say, no, you're not. Night came too quickly. Marin tried to eat, but her stomach was a knot of fear. She paced the cabin, clutching the letter, rereading it until the words blurred. Come willingly, or be claimed by those who hunt you. She had no food left, no way out, and whatever had been circling the cabin was still out there, waiting. She had no choice. As darkness fell, she heard it again, the scratching. But this time it was more aggressive, more insistent. Claws scraped against wood, testing the walls, the door, the windows. And then a voice, low, hissing, nothing like Aaron's. Give us the ring, mortal. Give it to us, and we will let you live. Marin backed away from the door, her pulse roaring in her ears. The ring on her finger grew hot, almost burning. I don't understand what you want. The king's mark. You wear it. You do not deserve it. The scratching intensified. The door shook. A window cracked. And then something broke through. A pale, gaunt figure tore the shutter from the window and began clawing its way inside, its eyes black as pitch, its mouth too wide, filled with needle-sharp teeth. It moved with unnatural speed, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Marin screamed and stumbled backward, raising her arm instinctively to shield herself. The ring flared. Brilliant white light exploded from the black iron, flooding the cabin like a miniature sun. The creature shrieked, a sound so piercing it shattered the cracked window, and recoiled violently, its skin blistering where the light touched it. It hissed once more, then vanished into the darkness, moving too fast to follow. Marin collapsed to her knees, gasping, staring at the ring on her hand. The light had faded, but the metal still glowed faintly, pulsing with that strange, steady rhythm. Protection. The ring wasn't just a token. It was a shield, a mark, a claim. And it was also a beacon calling to whatever was out there. She couldn't stay here. Not anymore. Marin stood slowly, her decision made. She pulled on her coat, tucked the black letter into her pocket alongside what little food remained, and gripped the fire poker one last time. Then she unbolted the door. The night air hit her like a slap, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and something older, something metallic. The forest stretched out before her, dark and infinite. And above, breaking through the clouds, the moon began to rise. But it wasn't silver. It was red, blood red, massive, and impossibly bright, casting the snow in hues of crimson and shadow. The entire world seemed to hold its breath beneath its gaze. Marin clutched the letter, her heart pounding. The ring pulsed in response to the moon, growing warmer with each passing second. She didn't know where she was going, but the ring did. And as she stepped off the porch and into the snow, she whispered into the night, "I'm coming." Somewhere in the darkness, something answered. The forest was alive with shadow. Marin walked through snow that glowed crimson beneath the blood moon, each step crunching too loudly in the unnatural silence. The ring on her finger pulsed steadily, pulling her forward like a compass needle drawn to true north. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The trees grew denser, their branches weaving overhead into a canopy that blocked out even the moon's eerie light. Darkness pressed in from all sides. Marin's breath came in short, visible puffs, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then the wind stopped. Completely. The forest held its breath. Marin froze, every nerve screaming danger. The ring burned hot against her skin. And then he appeared. It wasn't a gradual approach. There was no sound of footsteps, no warning. One moment the path ahead was empty. The next, he stood there, as though he'd stepped out of the shadows themselves. Lucian. But not the desperate, frost-covered stranger who had begged shelter at her door. This was something else entirely. He stood in a swirl of snow and darkness that moved around him like living smoke, his silver-white hair no longer plastered with ice but flowing freely, catching the moonlight. His eyes glowed crimson, not faintly, not subtly, but with an inner fire that made Marin's breath catch. Gone was the traveler's coat. In its place, he wore dark armor, archaic plates of blackened metal etched with the same thorns and wings design as the ring. A heavy cloak draped from his shoulders, its edges seeming to dissolve into shadow. He looked like what he was. A king. Marin Hale, he said, and his voice was different now, deeper, resonant with command, carrying a weight that made the air itself feel heavier. You came. She took an involuntary step back, gripping the fire poker she'd brought. Stay away from me. I cannot. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone and sorrow. Not anymore. Movement beside him caught her eye. A small figure stepped out from behind Lucian's cloak, Aaron, no longer pale and trembling with fever, but healthy, whole. His cheeks had color. His eyes were bright. The small crown sat properly on his head now, gleaming darkly in the moonlight. And when he saw Marin, his entire face lit up. Marin. Arin broke away from Lucien and ran to her, his small arms wrapping around her legs with surprising strength. Marin's anger faltered. She looked down at the boy clinging to her, so warm and alive, and felt something crack inside her chest. Her free hand moved instinctively to his hair, smoothing it back from his forehead the way she had that first night. You're okay," she whispered. "Because of you," Lucien said quietly. She looked up at him, and the fury came flooding back. "You left. You vanished without a word, without an explanation." Her voice broke. "I thought I'd gone insane. I thought I'd imagined you." "I know." There was genuine remorse in his voice, but no apology. "And for that, I am sorry. But there are things you must understand." "Then explain," Marin snapped. "Explain why creatures are hunting me. Explain the ring. Explain why you left this." She held up her hand, the black iron gleaming, and disappeared like a ghost. Lucien's gaze fell to the ring, and something flickered across his face. Satisfaction, possessiveness, something darker. "You wear it. I can't take it off." "No, you cannot." He stepped closer, and Marin forced herself not to retreat. "Because you accepted it. And in doing so, you accepted what it means." "Which is what?" "Protection. Allegiance." His eyes met hers, burning with intensity. "A claim." The word hung in the air, between them like a blade. Marin's heart raced. "I didn't accept anything. You left it on my table." "And you took it," Lucien interrupted, his voice softening. "You could have thrown it away, buried it in the snow, cast it into the fire. But you kept it. You carried it with you. And tonight, when the darkness came for you, you wore it." She had no answer for that. Lucien exhaled slowly, and for the first time since he'd appeared, he looked almost human. Tired. Burdened. "Let me tell you the truth, Marin Hale. All of it." Arin took her hand, his small fingers curling around hers, and somehow that simple gesture steadied her. "Speak," she said. Lucien's jaw tightened. "I am Lucien Draven, king of the Eternal Court. I have ruled my people for more centuries than your kind have recorded. And this," he gestured to Arin, "is my son, Crown Prince Arin, heir to the throne of shadows." Marin stared at him. Part of her wanted to laugh, to call him insane. But she'd seen too much. Felt too much. "Vampires," she whispered. "Yes. And you came to my door. Not by chance." Lucien's expression darkened. 3 months ago, Arin was cursed by a rival faction seeking to usurp my throne. The curse was designed to burn him from the inside, slowly, painfully, until there was nothing left. No healer could touch it. No spell could break it. Marin looked down at Arin, who gazed up at her with complete trust. "But he's fine now. Because of you." Lucien took another step closer. "There is an old prophecy, Marin. One spoken long before your great-grandmothers were born. It speaks of the Heartbearer, a mortal of rare lineage and boundless compassion whose very presence can soothe the darkness that plagues our kind." Her breath caught. That's insane." "Is it?" His voice was gentle now, almost tender. "You felt it that night. When you touched him, his fever broke. When you held his hand, he slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Your warmth, your humanity, it anchored him when nothing else could." Marin shook her head, backing away. "I didn't do anything special. I just—" "You opened your door to a stranger in a storm," Lucien said, his voice raw. "You gave shelter when you had none to spare. You offered kindness when the world had taught you to be afraid." He stopped just in front of her, so close she could see the centuries of pain etched in his face. "You saved my son. You saved the future of my kingdom. And the ring of sovereigns. It is worn only by the reigning monarch." His gaze dropped to her hand. "I left it because I owed you more than gratitude. I left it because he stopped, jaw clenching. Because what? Marin demanded. His eyes met hers, and the honesty in them was devastating. Because if I had stayed another moment in your presence, I would not have been able to walk away. The words hit her like a physical blow. She felt the heat rising in her face, felt the air between them crackling with something dangerous and undeniable. I don't understand, she whispered. You will. Lucien extended his hand, palm up, an invitation. But first, you must come with me. The blood moon gathering has begun. My court awaits. And you, Marin Hale, are under my protection now, whether you wish it or not. Marin looked at his hand, at the ring on her finger, at Arin, who still held her other hand, refusing to let go. Every rational part of her screamed to run. But she'd stopped listening to the rational parts days ago. If I go with you, she said slowly, will you tell me everything? No more secrets. I will tell you everything, Lucien promised. Even the truths you may not wish to hear. She hesitated for one more breath. Then, trembling, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, cold but steady, strong but gentle. The ring on her finger flared with light, and she felt it. The connection, undeniable and ancient, threading between them like fate made tangible. Lucien's expression softened, just for a moment. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Marin muttered. I still don't trust you. A faint smile ghosted across his lips. That is wise. The shadows around them began to move, swirling like a living storm. Arin squeezed her hand tighter. And as the world dissolved into darkness and cold, Marin heard Lucien's voice, soft and certain. Hold on to me.
She did.
And they vanished into the night. The world reformed around her in fragments, shadow first, then cold stone beneath her feet, then the overwhelming scent of iron and ancient earth. Marin stumbled, her legs threatening to give out. Lucien's hand tightened around hers, steadying her. Arin pressed close to her other side, his small presence grounding her as nausea rolled through her stomach. Breathe, Lucien commanded softly. The disorientation will pass. She forced air into her lungs and looked up, and forgot how to breathe entirely. They stood at the edge of a massive underground citadel carved from obsidian and shadow. Towering spires rose impossibly high, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting the blood-red moonlight that poured through a vast opening in the cavern's ceiling above. The architecture was ancient, older than anything Marin had ever seen, Gothic and brutal and hauntingly beautiful all at once. And it was filled with them, vampires. Dozens of them lined the grand staircase that led to the throne hall, dressed in dark finery that ranged from medieval grandeur to modern elegance. Their skin was uniformly pale, their eyes glowing in shades of red, gold, and silver. They stood with preternatural stillness, watching the new arrivals with expressions that ranged from curious to contemptuous. The whispers began immediately. A mortal. He brings a human here? Under the blood moon? Has the king gone mad? Marin's fingers tightened around Lucien's hand. She felt their stares like physical weight, predatory and assessing. Some looked at her with hunger, others with disdain. All of them looked at her like she didn't belong. Because she didn't. Stay close, Lucien murmured, his voice low and edged with warning. Do not leave my side. Do not speak unless I give you leave. And do not, under any circumstances, show fear. Too late for that, Marin whispered back. His grip shifted, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in what might have been reassurance. You are under my protection. No one will touch you. A figure detached from the crowd, a tall, elegant woman with raven-black hair and eyes like molten gold. She descended the stairs with liquid grace, her gown trailing behind her like smoke. My king, she said, her voice silk over steel. You returned to us at last. Her gaze slid to Marin, and her smile turned cold. With company. Lady Seraphine, Lucien acknowledged, his tone neutral. The gathering proceeds as planned? It does. though your absence was noted. Seraphine's eyes lingered on Marin, assessing, calculating. And now I see what detained you. A mortal. How unexpected. Is it? Lucien's voice carried a subtle edge that made several nearby vampires shift uncomfortably. Before Seraphine could respond, another voice cut through the crowd, deeper, harder, filled with barely restrained contempt. This is an insult. A man strode forward, broad-shouldered and imposing, his armor more ornate than Lucien's, but somehow less regal. His eyes burned crimson as they fixed on Marin with undisguised hostility. "Lord Theron," Lucien said, his tone cooling several degrees. "You bring a mortal to the Blood Moon gathering?" Theron's voice rose, echoing through the citadel. "You parade your weakness before the entire court?" "I parade nothing," Lucien replied, deadly calm. "I bring what is mine. She is a liability." Theron gestured sharply at Marin. "A fragile, fleeting thing that will be dead before the century turns. And yet you bind yourself to her." He turned to address the crowd. "Our king has lost his way. He allows sentiment to cloud his judgment." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered vampires. Arin pressed closer to Marin, his small hand gripping hers tighter. She could feel him trembling, not with fear, but with anger. Theron's gaze dropped to the boy, and his expression shifted, became calculating. And the prince, still clinging to the mortal who supposedly saved him. He took a step forward. Perhaps it is time for the heir to be properly cared for, by his own kind. He reached for Arin. Lucien moved. It wasn't a step, it was a blur of shadow and speed. One moment he stood beside Marin. The next he was directly in front of Theron, his hand wrapped around the lord's wrist in a grip that made the other vampire's face contort with pain. "Touch my son," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that somehow carried through the entire hall, "and I will remove your hand, then your arm, then everything else, piece by piece, until there is nothing left of you but ash and memory." The citadel went silent. Theron's eyes widened, genuine fear flickering across his face. "My king, I only meant." "I know what you meant." Lucien released him with a contemptuous shove. "And I reject it. Arin stays with me. And with her." He turned back to Marin, his expression softening fractionally as he extended his hand again. "Come." Marin's heart was racing, but she took his hand and let him guide her up the stairs. Arin walked between them, still holding her other hand, refusing to let go even as the vampire nobles parted before them like a dark sea. The throne hall opened before them, a vast chamber dominated by a throne of black stone and silver veins, positioned directly beneath the opening where the blood moon shone down like a spotlight. Lucien stopped at the base of the dais, but he didn't ascend to the throne. Instead, he turned to face the assembled court, Marin and Arin still at his side. The vampires gathered in a semicircle, their eyes gleaming in the crimson light. The atmosphere was thick with tension, with ancient politics and barely concealed hostility. Lady Seraphine stepped forward, her voice carrying a false sweetness. "My king, the court has gathered as you commanded. We await your explanation." Her gaze slid to Marin. "Why have you brought this mortal into our sacred hall? Why does she wear the ring of sovereigns? And why," her voice hardened, "do you allow her to stand at your side as though she has earned that right?" Lucien's hand tightened imperceptibly around Marin's. She felt Arin press closer, his small body radiating defiance. "The court demands answers," Theron said from the crowd, emboldened by Seraphine's challenge. "Who is this mortal to you, Lucien Draven? And what claim does she have on our king?" Every eye in the hall was fixed on Marin, predatory, hostile, hungry. She forced herself to stand straight, to meet their gazes even though her legs were shaking, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. Lucien stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between her and the court, his presence a shield. "You want answers?" His voice rang out, commanding and absolute. "Then you shall have them." The blood moon above pulsed, as if in anticipation. And the vampire king prepared to reveal the truth that would change everything. Lucien raised his left hand, and silence fell like a blade. Every vampire in the hall watched as he slowly, deliberately removed the ring of sovereigns from Marin's finger. The black iron gleamed in the blood-red moonlight, the thorns and wings crest catching the light as he held it up for all to see. Then, with movements that carried the weight of ceremony, he slipped it onto his own hand. The ring flared with dark light, and the entire citadel seemed to pulse in response. The walls, the air, the very shadows themselves acknowledging their king. "This," Lucien said, his voice resonating through the chamber with absolute authority, "is the Ring of Sovereigns. It has been worn by every ruler of the Eternal Court since the first blood moon rose over these halls." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "I have worn it for 7 centuries. And 5 nights ago, I left it in the hands of a mortal woman." The murmurs began again, shocked and scandalized, but Lucien's raised hand silenced them. "Her name is Marin Hale, and she saved my son's life." Arin stepped closer to Marin, his small hand finding hers again. She could feel him trembling, not with fear, but with something fierce and protective. 3 months ago, Lucien continued, his voice cutting through the hall like winter wind, the Crown Prince was cursed by those who sought to destroy our bloodline. No healer could touch the affliction. No ancient magic could break it. He burned with fever that should have killed him a dozen times over. His jaw tightened. "I searched the world for cure, and found nothing but despair." The court had gone deathly still. Even Theron and Seraphine watched with rapt attention. Until the night of the storm. Lucien's gaze swept across the assembled vampires. "When the curse reached its peak and my son's life hung by a thread, fate led me to a cabin in the mountains. To a woman who had every reason to turn us away, and who opened her door anyway." He turned slightly, his eyes finding Marin's. The intensity in them made her breath catch. "She gave us shelter, warmth, a kindness we had no right to expect." His voice softened, just fractionally. "And when she touched my son, the curse quieted." For the first time in months, Arin slept without pain, without fire consuming him from within. A collective gasp rippled through the court. "Impossible," Lady Seraphine whispered. "No mortal has such power." "Not power," Lucien corrected, his voice hardening again. "Humanity. Compassion. The very qualities our kind abandoned centuries ago." He lifted the ring higher. "The prophecy speaks of the Heartbearer, a mortal whose presence can anchor our darkness, whose touch can soothe what magic cannot heal. I have lived through 20 generations of mortals, and never once did I believe the prophecy was anything more than myth." He looked at Marin again, and something profound passed between them. "Until her." The words hung in the air like a confession. "Marin Hale is the Heartbearer." Lucien's voice rang out with absolute certainty. "She saved the Crown Prince. She saved the future of this kingdom. And for that," he placed his free hand over his heart in a gesture of profound respect, "I owe her my life, my blood, and my eternal protection." Some of the vampires bowed their heads in acknowledgement. Others remained rigid, their expressions dark with resentment. Theron stepped forward, his face twisted with contempt. "This is absurdity. You would bind yourself to a mortal based on superstition and sentiment. She is a distraction, Lucien. A weakness your enemies will exploit." "My enemies already know." Lucien's voice dropped to something lethal. "Why do you think creatures stalked her cabin? Why do you think lesser vampires tried to tear the ring from her hand?" His eyes glowed brighter, more dangerous. "They know what she is. They know what she means. Then she is a liability." Another vampire surged forward from the crowd, a younger lord with wild eyes and bared fangs. "She has no place here. She pollutes our sacred halls with her mortal stench." He lunged toward Marin. Lucien moved like lightning. His hand caught the vampire by the throat mid-leap, slamming him into the obsidian floor with enough force to crack the stone. The sound echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. Lucien's fangs descended, long, wickedly sharp, gleaming in the moonlight. His eyes burned with an inhuman fury that made every vampire in the room take an involuntary step back. "Touch her," he snarled, his voice no longer entirely human, "and you forfeit not just your life, but your entire bloodline. I will hunt down every vampire you have sired, every descendant who carries your tainted blood, and I will erase you from existence so thoroughly that history will forget you ever drew breath." The vampire beneath him whimpered, clawing uselessly at Lucien's iron grip. "Do you understand me?" Lucien's voice was death itself. "Why, yes, my king." Lucien released him with disgust, and the vampire scrambled backward, disappearing into the crowd. The king straightened, his fangs still visible, his posture radiating lethal authority. He turned slowly to address the entire court. "Let me be absolutely clear." His voice carried to every corner of the citadel. "Marin Hale stands under my protection. She wears my claim. She has earned her place at my side through her own merit, not through birth, not through power, but through the one thing none of you possess." He paused, letting the insult land. "Courage." Seraphine's expression had gone carefully blank. Theron's jaw clenched with barely contained rage. But neither dared speak. "If any among you cannot accept this," Lucien continued, his tone final, "you are free to leave my court. Permanently." No one moved. "Good." He turned back to Marin, and his expression softened fractionally. The inhuman fury faded, leaving only the man, ancient, weary, and fiercely protective. He extended his hand to her. "Come. Stand with me." Marin's legs felt like water, but she forced them to move. Arin walked beside her, his small hand still gripping hers tightly as they approached the dais. Lucien guided her to stand at his right side, the position traditionally reserved for a queen or consort. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Fresh murmurs rippled through the crowd, but this time, no one dared object. Arin looked up at Marin, his young face solemn. Then, in the ringing silence of the hall, he spoke, his voice small but clear. "Don't go." Marin's heart shattered. She knelt down, bringing herself to his eye level. "Arin." "Please," the boy whispered, and there were tears in his eyes. "You made the bad dream stop. You made me warm." His small hands clutched at her coat. "Don't leave us." She looked up at Lucien, searching his face for answers, for understanding, for something. What she found there terrified her. Not cruelty, not manipulation, but raw, undeniable truth. He had meant every word. The ring, the protection, the claim. She was bound to him now, to them both, in ways she didn't fully understand. And whether she'd chosen this or simply stumbled into it didn't matter anymore. The bond was real. The danger was real. And the vampire king standing before her, looking at her like she was something precious and irreplaceable, was the most real thing she'd ever known. Marin took a shaking breath and turned back to Arin. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, just as she had that first night in her cabin. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. And as the words left her lips, the ring on Lucien's hand pulsed with light, binding them all together, forever. The journey back was gentler this time. Lucien didn't simply tear through shadow and distance. He carried her through it, his arms steady around her, his presence a shield against the disorienting pull of darkness. Marin pressed her face against his shoulder, feeling the strange coldness of his skin, the stillness where a heartbeat should have been. And yet she'd never felt safer. When the world reformed around them, it was to the familiar creak of old wood and the scent of pine and wood smoke. Her cabin. Marin's feet touched the worn floorboards, and she pulled away from Lucien, taking in the space that had been her sanctuary for so long. The fire still burned low in the hearth, impossibly, as though no time had passed at all. Snow fell gently outside the windows, illuminated by the fading light of the blood moon. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Except her. She was different now. Changed. Marked by things she couldn't undo. "Why did you bring me back here?" she asked quietly, not turning to look at him. "Because this is where it began." Lucien's voice was soft, contemplative. "Where fate tied our lives together." She turned then and found him standing by the couch, Aaron cradled in his arms. The boy was sleeping peacefully, his small face relaxed, his breathing steady and deep. The crown sat crooked on his head again, but now it looked natural. A part of him, not a burden. He looked like any child being carried by a devoted father. Except his father was the vampire king, and the child in his arms was an immortal prince who would outlive empires. "He's completely healed," Marin observed. "Yes." Lucien gazed down at his son with an expression of such tender relief it made her chest ache. "Thanks to you. I still don't understand how. I'm nobody. Just a woman who showed kindness when the world told you not to." Lucien's eyes met hers. Just a mortal who chose compassion over fear. Just a soul pure enough to anchor darkness itself. He paused. "That is not nobody, Marin Hale. That is extraordinary." She wanted to argue, to deflect, but the sincerity in his voice stopped her. Lucien moved to the couch and laid Aaron down gently, arranging the old quilts around him with the same careful devotion she'd witnessed that first night. The boy murmured something in his sleep, reaching instinctively for Marin. Her heart clenched. When Lucien straightened, he removed the ring of sovereigns from his hand. The black iron gleamed in the firelight, catching the shadows, the thorns and wings crest seeming to shift and breathe. "I need to speak with you," he said. "Truly speak with you. Without the court. Without politics. Just us." Marin crossed her arms, trying to maintain some distance, even as everything inside her pulled toward him. "All right. Speak." He studied the ring in his palm for a long moment, as though gathering words that had been locked away for centuries. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "For 700 years, I have ruled without question. I have commanded armies. I have ended wars and started them. I have walked through history as an observer, untouched by the fleeting concerns of mortals." He looked up at her. "I believed I had transcended human weakness, love, hope, vulnerability. I thought I had become something beyond such things." Snow continued to fall outside, soft and eternal. And then a desperate stranger knocked on a cabin door in a blizzard. He continued, a faint, almost self-deprecating smile touching his lips. And a frightened woman with every reason to refuse opened it anyway. Marin's throat tightened. "You didn't just save Aaron's life that night, Marin. You." He stopped, searching for words. "You reminded me of what I had forgotten. What I thought I no longer needed." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You reminded me what it feels like to be human." "You're not human," she said softly. "No, I'm not." He took a step closer. "But you made me remember what it was like to be. To feel gratitude. To feel hope. Another step. To feel things I thought were buried with my mortality centuries ago." Marin's pulse hammered in her throat. "Lucien." "I left the ring because I had to walk away," he said, his words coming faster now, more urgent. "Because if I had stayed in your presence for one more hour, one more moment, I would have done something unforgivable." "What?" His eyes met hers, burning with an intensity that stole her breath. "I would have asked you to come with me. To leave your world behind. To step into mine." His jaw clenched. "And that would have been selfish. Pfuh. You deserve the choice to refuse. To forget. To go back to your life." "Except you left the ring," Marin said, her voice barely steady. "You left your claim." "I did." There was no apology in his voice now, only fierce honesty. "Because even though every rational thought told me to let you go, something deeper, something I cannot name or control, refused to sever the connection." He moved closer still, until only a breath of space separated them. "The prophecy calls you the heart-bearer. My court calls you a mortal under royal protection." His voice dropped, intimate and devastating. "But I call you the woman who awakened something I thought had died centuries ago." "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "My heart." The admission hung between them, fragile and impossible and utterly true. Lucien lowered himself to one knee, not as a king, but as a man. He held the ring out to her, balanced on his open palm. "Marin Hale," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion burning in his eyes. "Thank you for opening the door. Thank you for showing mercy to strangers who had no right to ask it. Thank you for saving my son." He paused. "Thank you for reminding me that even monsters can be redeemed by one act of genuine kindness." Tears blurred Marin's vision. "You have a choice now," Lucien continued. "The choice I should have given you from the beginning. You can refuse this ring. Refuse the bond. I will honor that decision. I will protect you from afar, ensure no creature of darkness ever threatens you again, and then I will disappear from your life completely." His hand trembled, just slightly. "Or," he said, his voice softening, "you can accept it. Not as a subject, not as a servant, but as my equal, my partner. The one soul in all the endless centuries who makes immortality feel like something worth having." Snow tapped gently against the windows, a rhythm like a heartbeat. "If you take this ring," Lucien said, "you will be bound to my world, to danger, to darkness, to things you cannot yet imagine. Your life will never be simple again. You will face threats from my enemies, judgment from my court, and challenges I cannot even foresee." His eyes searched hers. "But you will also have my protection, my allegiance, and my—" He hesitated, as though the word itself was dangerous. "My devotion. For as long as you wish for it." Marin stared at the ring, her mind racing. Everything he offered terrified her. The danger, politics, the impossibility of loving someone who would watch her age and die while he remained unchanged. But then she heard it, a small, sleepy voice from the couch. "Marin?" She turned. Aron had shifted in his sleep, his small hand reaching out toward her, his face peaceful but searching. "Stay with us," the boy murmured, half dreaming. "Please stay." Something inside her shattered and reformed all at once. She looked back at Lucien, still kneeling, still holding the ring, still waiting with a patience that spoke of centuries, but an expression that showed only human vulnerability. "If I take this," she said slowly, "what happens to me? Do I become like you?" "Not unless you choose it," Lucien said. "The ring binds you to me, to Aron, to our kingdom, but it does not change what you are. You remain human, mortal." His voice roughened. "And when your time comes, I will let you go. I will honor your humanity until the very end." "That's not fair to you." A sad smile ghosted across his face. "Fairness has nothing to do with fate." Marin took a shaking breath. She thought about the years she'd spent in isolation, hiding from the world, afraid to trust, afraid to hope. She thought about the stranger who'd appeared at her door with desperate eyes and a dying child. She thought about the way Aron had smiled at her, the way Lucien looked at her like she was the only thing in all his endless existence that truly mattered. She thought about the choice, safety or significance, isolation or belonging, fear or faith. And then she stopped thinking entirely. Marin reached out and took the ring from Lucien's palm. It was cold at first, then warm, then something deeper, like it was recognizing her, claiming her, welcoming her home. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The moment the metal touched her skin, light flared, not harsh, but gentle, like dawn breaking after an endless night. The ring settled into place, and she felt it, the connection threading between her and Lucien, binding their fates together with invisible ties stronger than any chain. Lucien's breath caught. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked utterly human, shocked, hopeful, grateful. "Marin." She pulled him to his feet and, before courage could desert her, stood on her toes and pressed her lips to his. He froze for half a heartbeat, Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and he kissed her back with a desperation that spoke of centuries of loneliness finally finding relief. His lips were cool but gentle, his touch reverent, as though she might disappear if he held too tightly. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, snow continued to fall outside, soft, eternal, beautiful. "I'm terrified," Marin whispered against his chest. "So am I," Lucian admitted, his voice rough. "I don't know how to live in your world. I don't know how to live in yours." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hand coming up to cup her face. "But perhaps we can learn together." From the couch, Aron's sleepy voice rose. "Does this mean she's staying?" Marin laughed, the sound watery but genuine. "Yeah, little prince. I'm staying." Aron's face split into the brightest smile she'd ever seen. Lucian's arms tightened around her, and for the first time in 700 years, the vampire king allowed himself to believe in something more fragile and more powerful than any kingdom. He believed in hope. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair, "for opening the door." Marin closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger, the steady presence of Lucian beside her, the peaceful breathing of Aron on the couch. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for knocking." Outside, the blood moon finally set, and the first light of dawn began to break over the mountains, soft, tentative, and full of impossible promise. And in a small cabin where fate had once come calling in a storm, 3 souls found something none of them had dared to hope for. They found home.